Hello to everyone. I would like to start my words to congratulate the Philosopher team that carried out this important organization. I would like to thank the Serdar Öztürk for invitation for that session called Philosopher Directors. I am an architect, deal with the power of visual arrangement. So I really sincerely respect and admire directors and the filmmakers. Moreover, if there are philosophical directors, then there is talk of miracles. So you are in the session of miracles, I can say. We have very important speakers in this brilliant session, and we will leave the stage to Shamir. He is also the keynote speaker, so he will make his presentation about his special field. He is directed, produced, written, and edited dozens of short films that have been presented in a wide range of film festivals, galleries, and museums. He is really good at his job because he has won many awards, including a gold medal in the Academy of Motion Picture Arts. Maybe we can talk much more about his CV, his special field, but I think you will prefer to listen to him instead of talking about him. It is better to give the stage. Dear Shamir will talk about cinematic philosophy and the visual revolution. Thank you for your effort and your contribution. Stage is yours, dear Shamir, Shamir.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for this generous introduction. I'm honored. I'm also honored and privileged to talk to you today at this lovely and wonderful conference. In this talk, I will go over some of the key ideas from the cinematic philosophy book I published in 2016 with Paolo Macmillan. I will also talk about the choice of being a filmmaker and a theoretician. We'll talk about what media and cinema and film can give philosophy that the written text and the oral lectures cannot. Also go over some of, and finish with the exciting and fearless revolution, visual revolution that is happening in our time and how it's connected to each and one of us sitting in this room hearing this lecture. So first and foremost, I want to say that I'm a filmmaker, as well as also a film philosophy theoretician. I've been working in the independent filmmaking world for quite some time. I wrote 4 feature scripts. I made many short films. One of them won the Student Academy Awards from the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sounds in Los Angeles. At the same time, I also have a PhD in film and philosophy, and I published this book with Macmillan, which is based on my PhD dissertation. When I was a young film student, a few professors told me that I have to make the choice between being a filmmaker or an academic or philosophical academic. But I, on the other hand, felt that there is a deep eminence and connection between the two worlds that can feed each other in a way that hasn't been seen before. For me, filmmaking wasn't just a craft or an art. It is the language of the future. And to me, great films are a window to the big questions of life. You know, we all are thrown into this world with no real answers, and good films can give us a glimpse on what it is to be human. At the same time, if we learn the language of cinema or the language of the future, which I believe it is, might as well be knowledgeable with the deepest and most thought-provoking perspectives about humanity, which to me is philosophy. And in a nutshell, philosophy is the exploration of the world from the most basic and essential tool we have, which is our mind. Using mostly the tools of the mind, such as deduction, logic, analysis of concepts and ideas, and dealing with really tough, hard questions that we don't normally do and deal on a daily basis. For example, like what is real, what is matter, what is thinking, what is the limit of our thinking, what is the right thing to do, what is ethical, and so forth. Jumping back to the cinematic philosophy book, I gotta be honest that it came out of a frustration. When I did my undergrad in philosophy, and I was also working in film and media at the same time, And when I moved to New York to do my master's in film and media at the New School, as a young and aspiring filmmaker and someone who wanted to also engage with deep philosophical ideas about life, and I say this with the utmost respect, I wasn't too satisfied with the majority of books and writings I read on the relationship between film and philosophy specifically. And if I can sum it up, most of the writing at that time came from philosophy professors. All are extremely smart, hardworking professors that master the philosophy discipline in a very deep way. But the majority of them didn't come from the film theory or filmmaking world. And know that most of them did not make a film or grab the camera, edit it, wrote a script, develop characters, and so forth, everything we engage when creating a film. So it created an imbalance with the majority of the writings. That's what I felt. And if I can sum it up, the majority of the writings usually just briefly mention the film they use, and then they rush to the philosophy. So they basically are using the film to talk about Descartes or Kant or any other philosophical theory that they're interested in, but they kind of like leave the film on the side. On top of this, this type of path and method gives a very limited potential to how much film can actually create philosophy. Because the majority of these writings argue that film at best can serve as an illustration to a philosophical text. This to me created a very unbalanced view of within the film and philosophy discipline. And I have 2.5 chapters in this book criticizing these theories, and I can spend a few hours talking about them, but this is not the right time and place.
Shamir, sorry for interrupting you, but yeah. The technical team warned me, you are really talking so fluent, perfect, and fast. And there is a problem, problem of translation. So is it possible to make it much more slow? Thank you. Sorry for that.
No problem. Thank you. I'll try. And if it's too fast, let me know. Okay, I'll try and like steer it down one gear. Let me know if it goes. All right. So one of the best advices I got as a young filmmaker was given to me by my filmmaker professor, Vlad Nikoli, is to make the film you want to see. And in a sense, just shifting that suggestion to my PhD dissertation, I wrote the book I wanted to read. And also, besides having an inner passion to understand the relationship between film and philosophy in a deeper way, I also felt it an opportunity, since as a filmmaker, I might be able to give a different and perhaps, if I get lucky, a fresh perspective on the film and philosophy world, because I come from a little bit of a different perspective. So the goal of, if I sum it up, the goal of the cinematic philosophy book is to establish a connection between film and philosophy and to answer some of the important and big questions within the film and philosophy field. For instance, we are analyzing films and finding philosophical evidence in them. Great, but why is it important? How is it referred to our time and place? Why would anyone care if, there's a few philosophical ideas or illustration in a certain film, and so on? So within this book and in this lecture, I will try in the few minutes that I have to establish, or at least given the idea of how cinema can become a new platform for philosophy. And although it might be different than the written text or lectures, it is equal in its potential to engage with philosophical ideas. If we think about the practice of philosophy, we automatically think about two mediums that philosophy has been taking place at. One is the oral, which is spoken lectures and dialogues, what we are doing right now. And the second is written, books and articles. And my goal is to show that our era and our time introduces a new possibility to create philosophical thinking, which I believe is cinema, or the cinematic medium. In order to begin establishing this ambitious goal, I ask a very strange question. But in philosophy, the questions are very important. Since they lay the foundation for any possible answer. So one of the main questions I ask within the book is why philosophy has always needed cinema. I know it's a strange question, since cinema is around, in existence for around 120 years, since 1895. And philosophy, well, philosophy is much older. But before we move on, I have to make one clarification. In this lecture, I use cinema as an umbrella term, which includes a wide spectrum of variations that can appear on different screens, such as the movie theater, television, videos, mobile phones, tablets, websites, online videos, and so on. I chose the word cinema because it originates from the Greek word kinema, meaning movement. So in a sense, cinema can express an idea through moving images and sounds. So if you think about the question of why philosophy has always needed cinema, it is actually a question about the relationship between film and philosophy. And understanding the relationship is very important, and it will help explain why finding philosophical evidence within film is important. In what capacity can films, cinema, or videos can create philosophy? Is it merely illustrations or representations to the books and articles that have been written? Or can they offer something else or something more? What can film give that the written and oral text cannot? Engaging with such questions is extremely important if we are to understand what is the big picture of the relationship between film and philosophy. This brings me to argue that the traditional methodology of finding philosophical within films has yet to, and will probably not, establish cinema as a new medium for philosophy. Will it help prove? Yes. Is it important? Of course. This is what we're all doing. But the method of finding philosophical evidence and analyzing what philosophy within films will not establish cinema as a medium for philosophy. How many philosophical analyses of films will it take to prove and convince people that cinematic medium can create philosophy? Is it 5, 50, 5,000, 50,000? How about the quality of each analysis? Some can be great, but some are so-so. So if an analysis is not that great, does that muddy the water for that entire discipline? I, on the other hand, believe that if there's a chance to show that the cinematic medium can create philosophy, it must come from exploring philosophy itself. And this is the reason why I engage with the question of why philosophy always needed cinema. Because if philosophy always needed cinema, then the relationship between the cinematic medium to philosophy will be based on necessity. And then a relationship that is based on necessity reveals that there is a strong and deep connection and bond between film and philosophy. In order to begin answering why philosophy has always needed cinema, we need to dive deep into the subject of thought experiments. Let me just throw a title here very quickly, because it is an important thing. So share screen, this, okay, share, great. And we got this, oh, of course it's not. All right, thought experiments. I'm just putting it on the thing so you can just get like a glimpse of that. And then we can go back. We'll have a few films, so we'll make it engaging later on, and more engaging in that sense. Okay, so in order to answer this question, we need to dive deep into the subject of thought experiments. And back in the early 2000s, a few theoreticians began investigating the relationship between thought experiments and films in a very serious way. I believe that the most thought-provoking and illuminating investigations is from Thomas Rothenberg, which is one of the most comprehensive theories on the subject, and on a personal level, inspired me deeply. By the way, Thomas Rothenberg is speaking right after this lecture. So I urge you all to stay for this for his lecture, as he's an incredible thinker and philosopher, and you should listen to everything that human has to say, especially about film and philosophy. In essence, Rothenberg's main methodological path is to show how specific philosophical techniques, such as thought experiments, are used in specific films. If certain films can provide a screening of thought experiments on screen, then cinema, in potential, can swing philosophy, or at least serve as an illustration for philosophical work. This has rightly so became one of the most, the main method and comprehensive understanding on the relationship on how films can engage with philosophy. I urge you all to go and read Rothenberg's book. By the way, I have it. It's a Bible for me in that sense. It's been a great inspiration, and it's excellent. Anyway, I, being inspired by Wattenberg deeply, offer a different perspective on thought experiments. And I believe there's also a huge potential in this, in the connection between thought experiments and films. In essence, what I suggest is to turn the exploration on its head. It is not merely that certain films can embody or be considered as thought experiments. It is actually the other way around. Thought experiments within philosophy signify a cinematic need within the discipline of philosophy, meaning that the entire phenomena of thought experiment within the history of philosophy points to a cinematic need that is located at the heart of philosophy. Thus, instead of searching for philosophical evidence in films, in order to establish the relationship between film and philosophy, we turn the exploration on its head, searching for cinematic evidence in the history of philosophy. And I believe that that connection, that search, that evidence is with thought experiments. And let's take an example. I argue that the key question about the much discussed allegory of the cave by Plato in the Republic is not the comparison to the first spectators of cinema and how the slaves are shackled onto the cave and are mesmerized by the moving images and sounds, has been made by many, many theoreticians in the past. The key question about the allegory of the cave is, why does Plato need to use such a narrative, visual, theatrical, and we can even say cinematic allegory in order to explain his metaphysics? Why would Plato, one of the greatest challengers and opposers to art's potential to express truth, needs to use such a visual device to explain his metaphysics? I argue that in order to understand and better explain his philosophy, Plato needs to think cinematically, 2,000 years before the birth of cinema. But it's not just Plato. And this is not an isolated incident. Why would Descartes use the evil genius to explain key concepts of his meditations? Why would Isaac Newton explain the orbit of the moon through cannonballs? Why would Schrödinger challenge quantum theory through cats? Why would any philosopher or scientist, for that matter, choose to use a narrative, visual, and what we can almost refer to as a cinematic technique that has an artistic flavor to it? One only needs to examine the list of philosophers and scientists who employ thought experiments within their theory, from Titus Lucretius, Descartes, Galileo, David Hume, John Locke, Berkeley, Leibniz, Ernst Mach, Pascal, Isaac Newton, Bertrand Russell, Erwin Schrödinger, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Albert Einstein, Hilary Putnam, and the list goes on. This is not an isolated event within philosophy. It's a pattern. And it's a pattern of thinking visually, theatrically, and cinematically within philosophy. So now the question is, do thought experiments signify a cinematic need? Although thought experiments can be identified as a visual or narrative need, I believe that identifying them as cinematic best describes the need they need. Let me take a sip of water here, because this brings me back to what we defined at the beginning as cinematic. Cinema originates from the Greek word kinema, meaning motion or movement. Cinema expresses ideas that are experienced and understood through moving images and sound. It is not merely a visual possibility, because a visual possibility could be a still image without sound and without movement. It is also not a narrative possibility, which could also be someone that one imagines when reading a book rather than see on screen. On the other hand, cinema incorporates visual images and sound, as well as the story and idea that are expressed through movement. So I argue that what best describes the need thought experiments signify within the history of philosophy is what we understand and call cinematic. On top of it, if we go back to Wattenberg's analysis of thought experiments and if, according to Wattenberg's theory, certain films can be considered thought experiments, then the other side of that equation is that certain thought experiments could be considered cinematic. So basically, we use Wattenberg's incredible analysis, but we just look at it from the other side of the equation. So this is the moment that we actually go beyond thought experiments. And this is the essence of my argument here. Because the key question to our argument is not directed toward thought experiments, but is directed toward the need thought experiments signify. A thought experiment is the name of a structured technique within the discipline of philosophy. It's a technique that signifies what I believe to be an essential need for a cinematic type of thinking located at the heart of philosophy. It is not by chance that Plato chooses to express aspects of his metaphysics through what could be understood as a cinematic tale known as the allegory of the cave. It is not by chance that all these philosophers and scientists use it as well. And in a sense, they all need to think cinematically to understand some of the most key and difficult, challenging, complex theories. But then the year 1895 comes along, and cinema is born at the Lumiere brothers with the arrival of a train screening at the Grand Café. If for centuries, all these philosophers and thinkers needed to think cinematically and just imagine it in their mind to solve some of the most complex and challenging problems, then post-1895, we can do much more than merely think or imagine cinematically. We can actually do it. So let's examine some of the consequences and of thought experiments in film. I argue, and this is another step forward, I argue now that merely considering films as traditional thought experiments, illustrations, or representation to a philosophical theory leads to a very limited perception of their philosophical potential. The technical possibility to manifest thought experiments as experienced on screen creates an upgraded version of the thought experiment that can no longer be considered a traditional thought experiment. Just even a glance at the basic definition of thought experiments within philosophy shows that there's something new here. And let me just share the screen again so we can have a look at, because this is a quote show screen. Okay, this is a quote that defines thought experiments. I'll just read it. Thought experiments are devices of the imagination used to investigate the nature of things. Thought experimenting often takes place when the method of variation is employed in entertaining imaginative suppositions. All right, let's go back. Stop share. Great. All right, so even just by definition, thought experiments are experiments that happen in thought and the imagination, devices of the mind. On the other hand, cinematic thought experiments are not merely confined to the laboratory of the mind, since they happen on a screen, television set, computer monitor, mobile phones, and so on. Another problem is the use of empirical data. If one of the main issues with traditional thought experiment is to consider how we can learn anything new about the world just from thinking without the use of empirical data, then without leaping to what is the definition of empirical data, whether it is the recording of sound or visual, manipulated or constructed, there is no doubt that cinema utilizes a certain type of empirical data from the empirical world. But the most dramatic difference is that with traditional thought experiment, one must imagine the thought experiment. But with the cinematic thought experiment, one can see and experience the thought experiment. And the difference between imagining philosophy to seeing and experiencing philosophy holds a huge potential to the discipline of philosophy and must be further investigated. Because if thought experiment signify a type of thinking that was always needed within philosophy, then the birth of cinema at 1895 might just offer a revolutionary possibility to philosophical wisdom and thinking. All right, at this point, I want to go to the next stage, which is to briefly go over some of the main steps of what comes after asking why and answering, or at least suggesting an answer, why philosophy has always needed cinema. But since we are obliged to the time, I can only glance at the main steps without getting into too many details. So the next big question that we dive deep into is what can cinema give philosophy that the written and oral medium cannot? To answer that, I actually go back to the days I was a film student. Since as a film student, one of the sentences I kept hearing from my professors was, don't say it, show it. And what I realized and what I learned is that film is very good in creating experiences. You don't say things, you show things. And by doing so, the audience goes through an experience while figuring out in their mind what is happening. However, there are many different ways to potentially show philosophy on the screen. And not all of them are pushing the full potential of that. I want to just briefly go over a few short examples for that, for having philosophy on screen, but which is not pushing the full potential of that. Just a quick example. The first and easiest one is to copy-paste the philosophical theory onto the screen and screen it. And this is an example that Rothenberg gives. Basically copy-paste the philosophical theory and have it scroll up like the titles of Star Wars in that sense. And let me just share this thing with you. And if, oh, sorry. I got you, I lost you for a second. Oh, here you are. Share screen. Boom. And great Star Wars. Is this going? All right, since we are short on time, I'm going to cut it there, but you get the point. Although this is philosophy, this is Nietzsche's On Proof in the Extramoral Sense, an incredible and inspiring theory and article. The fact that it's on the cinematic screen and scrolling up like Star Wars, as suggested and exemplified in Rothenberg's book, this does not make a film in philosophy, or maybe it is, but it's really not what we're looking for. It's really a limited thing. And if we go over some of the other, we could refer to as Nietzsche's total return. Doesn't need to be specifically to Nietzsche, but it could be referred to a concept raised by Nietzsche that is called the total return. There is a journey that makes us experience the total return from a certain perspective. It is an in-movement cinematic event. The audience is stuck with Bill Murray in this situation. And then he figures out with the character what is happening while it is happening. So the audience needs to think, wait, what is this? What's going on? What is happening? And it's very interesting, you know, this film takes you and puts you in a situation where all, you know, our daily worries about death and money, respect and fame are completely meaningless. And through this experience, the film asks and questions, what would one choose to do if all these, you know, the fear of death, money, fame didn't matter? And it does it as an experience. There's no voiceover. You don't have to imagine it. You see it and you get what is happening. He's stuck in that loop, which I think is a great example. I'll just jump quickly. How are we on time, Havva? Is this good? I mean,
actually, we are very happy to follow you, but you have a few minutes. Actually, if we give
how many minutes? Because so I
how
know,
many minutes do you need?
I think 15.
Let's make a cooperation in 10 minutes, okay?
All right, sounds good, excellent. So can I speak faster or?
It's okay. It's okay.
It's okay. Okay, I'll try and find that great balance. Okay, let's not waste time. Well, I was about to bring The Matrix, but everybody knows The Matrix. I mean, it is exciting. The Matrix 4 is coming out. I hope it's going to be great. But The Matrix is the same type of idea. There's no voiceovers. We see the experience of a very complicated epistemological gap that is presenting as an in-movement cinematic event. We see the world that Neo, Keanu Reeves, was living at the beginning, then he wakes up in that battery farm, and then he goes into the seemingly beyond the simulation or beyond his perception film. But I can't go into that too much, and let's just jump. Will I jump into The Godfather? Yes, you know what? I have to kind of like jump into this, but I'll go over it very quickly because I want to show, and this is, I think, an incredible example of show, don't tell. And this is not necessarily completely to film and philosophy, but it is connected to how we can experience and figure out very deep things with cinema. And I think it's like an incredible example. And, you know, this is The Godfather, 1972, Francis Ford Coppola. And let me just jump into it as quick as possible and just talk about this quickly without too much. All right, share screen. We had this. And then we got the matrix we skipped. We're just going to The Godfather. Great. Let's put this. All right, so just to give the context while this is playing out, Michael, played by Al Pacino, is going to visit his father. Michael is still a civilian at that time. So it means that he's not part of like his family criminal activities. And then he realizes that in the hospital, after his father, played by the wonderful Marlon Brando, has been gunned down and is lying in the hospital, there are no bodyguards. And he quickly realizes that, that an assassination will take place very, very soon. And then this fellow comes, Enzo, the baker. He basically just comes to just share respects to the Don, Marlon Brando. And then Al Pacino quickly figures out what's happening, and he realizes that if he doesn't act and puts like pretends to be the bodyguard, his father will be assassinated, and probably him. And then we are going into the scene outside, and this is still Michael is very seemingly kind of like not in the family business, not in the family. Oh, let's just go to this. Okay. And then Enzo, of course, standing outside. Now they're pretending to be bodyguards to hopefully scare the gangsters or the assassins away. And let's just see what's happening here. Right, these are the assassins. Look at them. Okay, good. Sorry, wrong one. Hold on a second. Let me just, okay, great. So, without too many words or dialogues, there's no words or dialogues, we learn so much about Michael. He's resourceful, how he can deal with immense pressure. And I mean, I just want to jump into like the lighter scene and how Enzo's hand is shaking and how Michael just grabs it so gently and so gracefully and just lights it and just gives it to him. And so much information, so much knowledge, so much deep knowledge that is being and understanding about his characters, and so much is being said without saying any word in that sense. We can understand, we can see that Michael can deal with immense pressure. We can see that he's resourceful. We can see that he's calm. We can see that he can become the godfather. And on top of it, just with that moment, just with that small moment of being calm under this immense pressure, he also stops on the lighter, and he also understands that. So much information and depth is shown without saying a word. Honestly, it's hard not to be impressed by the power of cinema and how rich it is, and how deep it can go into the world in that sense. And that's it. All right. I wanted to show a film that I did a few years ago, but unfortunately, because of time, I will have to jump forward. So I guess I will have to do this in the future. Okay, so let me just jump forward. Okay.
Time will become very squeezed, so
okay.
It's better for us to say the last sentences. Because we are really the back of the program, so.
Got you. Okay, I prepared this. No problem. Let me just finish a point. These examples basically show the potential of to experience philosophical wisdom and what it can take us. And there's a few other examples, but we don't have the time to do that. We don't have to imagine anything. We can see and experience philosophy or deep ideas, and we can experience them as a journey. And rather than reflecting or imagining philosophy, the potential we are talking about is the potential to create the experience of philosophical wisdom. And if we are to continue, we have to open our horizons to where philosophy can be created. And we have to show that the traditional way of doing philosophy, written and oral mediums, are not the pure, objective, or the only mediums to create philosophical thinking. And in order to do that, we have to go back to the history of philosophy again. And I will end with these remarks after that. At the birth of Western philosophy, the practice of philosophy wasn't naturally affiliated with the written tradition, but was more affiliated with the oral tradition. Long before writing took philosophy to unprecedented heights, suspicion and devaluation on the potential of the written text to engage with philosophical wisdom existed. One famous example is the great Socrates in the dialogue Phaedrus. In Phaedrus, Socrates challenges and devaluates the written text potential to engage and create philosophy. He argues that writing is inferior to speech, and I'm quoting, the written word cannot answer, but just repeat itself. It can fall into the hands of people who misinterpret it. It lacks a speaker. It is without the possibility of change. It cannot defend itself, and so forth. The Socratic mistake lies in Socrates' misconception of his era's upcoming technology, i.e. the written text potential to engage with philosophy. Think of all the heights that the collaboration between philosophy and the written text brought humanity, thought and wisdom, and realize that Socrates missed this potential. This shows that philosophy wasn't born with writing, and it is not purely connected to it. And if philosophy can be created in different mediums, then there might be a possibility to create it in the cinematic medium. Which, okay, this I have to jump, and then I have to, okay, oral philosophy, Spinozistic. I need to finish with like, okay, I'm jumping on a few excellent and exciting and juicy things, but all right, let's just wrap it up with a few last sentences and conclusions. And bring it up to our context and our time, because our time offers a different set of tools and demand a different set of tools to understand the changing world in front of our eyes. And if I cut to the chase, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to assess that we are shifting from a written-based society to a visual-based society. Therefore, we cannot and must not ignore these tectonic changes. Last time a shift like this, or kind of like this, happened was around 1440 in Germany, where Johannes Gutenberg created and invented the printing press, sparking the written revolution. As we set sail towards the 21st century, the visual world, whether through screen or moving images or emojis or any other thing, is becoming a new alphabet and a new language. And as Ludwig Wittgenstein said in the Tractatus, the limit of my language is the limit of my world. These changes are bound to change and create a new type of thinking and a new type of reality. Do we look at this new world with content and agony and a cry for a past that will never return? Or do we choose to look into the eyes of change and be a proactive part in it? Now more than ever, philosophy, the love of knowledge, is essential to our time to help make sense of the chaos with so many human rights violations, ethical changes, challenges, collapse of empires, the rise of mega companies, the rise of AI, on top of the transformation to a visual-based society. Will philosophy merely engage with the past, or will philosophy look at the present and future and be an active participant in this changing reality? But if we are to take part in this new world, it means also engaging with the language of the future. For too long, in my mind, philosophy has been closed in the academic ivory tower, away from the people, away from where it matters, away from where it can make a difference and a significant difference in the world. I believe it's time to bring philosophy back to the people, back to the marketplace, back to the agora, where it began with the Socratic dialogue.
Shamir, thank you very much for your presentation.
I will just end with one last sentence. Sorry, one last sentence. Let me just mention that René Descartes wrote in French, and at that time that was considered to be blasphemy because the accepted language for philosophy was Latin. But Descartes didn't merely aim at philosophers. He was writing for the people in the language of the people, and he invited them on one of the biggest conceptual revolutions in history and to human mind. So I urge you all to engage with film and philosophy, and also not to shy away from learning the craft of filmmaking as well, and also learning philosophy and finding a way to bring them together and to get to a lot of people. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to hear the other talkers as well, and also answer questions.
Thank you very much to Shamir. It is very nice speech, to a very provocative question, why philosophy has always needed cinema. Thank you for this, but it is impossible to get the question. I am very sorry. There is three questions, so it is better for us to jump the second speaker. He is Ioannis Mitsou. Aspects of meat in Pier Paolo Pasolini's cinema. So stage is yours, Ioannis.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And as we are focusing today on films, representations of visual reality, and on their ability to express visually both existential needs and aesthetic concerns, I would like to begin our communication today with an image, with a description of an image. The event takes place during the last minutes of Pier Paolo Pasolini's 1971 film, The Decameron, a very personal reading of Boccaccio's 17th century narrative work, and comes to our attention exactly because it seeks to redefine, in a very simple and yet very effective way, the relationship between the creation of myths in society through dream, through art, through cultural production, and the need for authentic experience of everyday reality. So, the image is the following. After a succession of various seductive encounters and visual representations of everyday life, the painter Giotto, interpreted by Pasolini himself, and this is not a coincidence, is drinking red wine together with his workers, while the chairs bears echo. There is a sense of solidarity between the men, and a general feeling of celebration of life. An almost ecstatic joy in the air, we could say. And as Giotto looks at his fresco, the work of art he has just completed, he says to himself, why create a work of art when dreaming about it is so much sweeter? Why indeed? In this line, we can feel the presence of a complicated view on the very idea of myth. Myth, in its various connotations, keeps appearing in Pier Pasolini's films as a constant theme and motif. And yet, there is also an unmistakable distance from it, a desire to approach reality in itself, away from its various transformations, especially the ones that stem from intellectual activity. Pasolini's filmic narratives seek to find aspects of the sacred that already exist in everyday life, not to re-establish them or use them in order to escape from here and now. On the contrary, what Pasolini seeks is exactly a lived experience in a most active way. So this tendency to read narratives in human appearances becomes clear when it comes to the unique in many ways faces of the people, something that Pasolini likes to focus on, especially the faces of the people of the lower classes, and Pasolini's insistence on small details like the missing teeth. Reality remains always a point of reference in the tradition of neorealism and even older concepts like the operatic verismo. But not simply we have to stress that reality as a social concept. In this relation between corporeality and mythic narrative, bodies and tales, what we can detect is actually a yearning for authenticity, a yearning carefully linked with the importance of lived experience, another important existential idea. Art in this sense has more to do with the existential call for action, an almost erotic call, as described, for example, in Kierkegaard's essay, Fear and Trembling. Miracles in Pier Pasolini's films are definitely present, but we have to remind ourselves that these miracles always take place in the area of the human body. If one point of reference in Pasolini's understanding of myths and poetic reality is existentialism, the other is phenomenology. And here it is that his works become truly cinematic. Just like in Maurice Merleau-Ponty's 1945 book, Phenomenology of Perception, that I really love and I suggest to everyone as a point of reference, exactly like in this book, observation of the world for Pasolini is not a passive condition, it is creative. So poetic in the literal sense, creating meaning. The question then that we already said, why create a work of art when dreaming about it is so much sweeter? In this light becomes less enigmatic. Indeed, dreaming and approaching reality, either through art or even directly through lived experience, are axioms that are never distinguished. To sum up, we can note at least three different understandings of the notion of myth in the cinematic work of Pier Pasolini. First, there is myth approached as an aesthetic concept, as a realm of reality. Here, Pasolini seems to be in dialogue with several thinkers, like the ideas of Henri Bergson, for example, his priority of intuition as a way to approach the real. Then there is myth in the literal sense, as a cultural product, as a source of inspiration. And we note at this point that at least three of Pasolini's films, Oedipus, Medea, and of course my favorite, his adaptation of 1,001 Nights, are clearly based on myths. Also, we could argue that all of his work follow the mythic as motifs, directly or indirectly. Last but not least, myth for Pasolini is something to be desired. It's associated with authenticity and by extension can be characterized by its absence.
Ioannis, I am very sorry. I don't want to interrupt your poetic and very nice presentation, but you have just 3 minutes.
3 more minutes? Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Okay. So, to sum up, it is the absence of myth that concerns Pasolini. It is exactly the fear that myth is going to get lost. In this way, his focus is always on the realm of reality, not on transcendence in order to speak in existential terms, not the need to escape reality, on the contrary, on immanence, on the need to come back in here and now. So what we can clearly see is that Pasolini's myths are far from comforting. This dynamic character that Pasolini attributes to myths is exactly what makes this underlying motif so liberating for us as well. Just like the powerful suggestions of existential continental philosophy, the term has nothing to do with self-reassuring understandings of myth-making. Pasolini's films struggle not only to interpret rhyme, but also to experience it. And I'd like to close with another phrase that Pasolini uses in 1001 Nights. In this phrase, we can see exactly the essence of his creative production. Reality doesn't hide in only one dream, but in many dreams. So in this idea that is an attack on Platonism, an attack on Christianity, we could add, an attack on seeking only one truth, so on nationalism as well, on any ideological construction, we can see something really liberating. So in many dreams it is that Pasolini seeks the mythic. And this return to lived experience in itself can prove to be not only self-fulfilling, but also liberating more than ever now, in times of fear and unrest. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would like also to thank you to you because you save our time, and your way of speak is very poetical. So cinema is not only a linguistic experience, but also it is philosophical experience. And as far as I learned, it is also the poetic experience. Thank you for that contribution. And our last speaker, you have 10 minutes, Niall. I am very sorry because we have really squeezed because the door was closed for 10 minutes. So we have to finish. Niall Kennedy will explain about the style Indirect, Libre, Gilles Deleuze, and the Pier Paolo Pasolini, like the first speaker. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi there. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I only wish I could be in Ankara with you to hear more of the papers, and thank you to the interpreters, which would mean I wouldn't have to learn Turkish very rapidly. 10 minutes isn't a great deal, so I'll have to compress some of what I've prepared. Today, I want to deliver some preliminary thoughts on an ongoing project that I have been working on, which has arisen out of my PhD research. And this project is on one of the first real philosophers of cinema, Gilles Deleuze, and his conception of authorship in the broad sense, which, contrary to prevailing critical opinion, I believe has a central importance to his philosophy as a whole, and not simply to his work on literature or cinema. So one of the 50 years after Roland Barthes preemptively declared the death of the author, I believe that the author is returning into the humanities as a whole, into our understandings of philosophy, literature, cinema, and art. One of the key defining characteristics of the Deleuzian author that I hope to explore in a forthcoming book is the relationship between that author and a major character or persona known in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy as the intercessor. I believe that so far a very partial picture of this concept has been presented in current criticism, but I believe that for Deleuze and Guattari, the most profound thought operates by means of an internal division between the thinker and the intercessor or friend, or between the author of a particular text and a significant character within that text. And elsewhere in other published work, I've traced that idea to the Portuguese poet and philosopher Fernando Pessoa. So I believe this idea of the relationship between author and character, or between author and intercessor, is one of the key relationships in Deleuze's philosophy, and one that we must fully understand, and explain in order to see how author or authorship in the Deleuzian sense truly functions. So in order to fully understand this relationship and how it's expressed, we have to go back to 19th century literature and 20th century cinema. I'm going to skip over the literature for reasons of time, but just to very quickly remind you of Gustave Flaubert and his most famous work, Madame Bovary, and indeed to take an example, a short example of a passage which will help us understand what I'm speaking about here, the operation of this process of free indirect discourse. Okay, and that is what I believe is at the heart of Deleuze's philosophical work. So let's take a quick example of a passage from Madame Bovary, and this is as she's a married woman, but she's just taken a lover. She's just committed to adultery for the first time, and now she's looking at herself in the mirror. She repeated, here I'm quoting, she repeated, "I have a lover, delighting at the idea as if a second puberty had come to her. So at last she was to know those joys of love, that fever of happiness of which she had despaired. She was entering upon a marvelous world where all would be passion, ecstasy, and delirium," end quote. So the last two sentences in particular seem to represent the views of the character Madame Bovary, but as expressed or vocalized by the narrator, perhaps the author's voice, Gustave Flaubert. An irony and ambiguity is created, such that we cannot know whether the view expressed, the positive view expressed on the act of adultery, is an objective judgment delivered by the narrator or a subjective one given by the principal character. And indeed, this argument was stressed at Flaubert's trial for obscenity, that although Flaubert as author never delivers an unequivocal condemnation of his character's deeds, nor can the sentences in the novel which seem to praise them be unequivocally attributed to him either. So there is just this creation of this irony and this ambiguity, this uncertainty which surrounds the technique of free indirect discourse. So looking therefore at the work of Pier Paolo Pasolini, this is a point at which I want to take into account the cinematic sources as well as his theoretical work, as far as I can, given limitations of time. So Pasolini, in his two major essays, Observations on the Sequence Shot and the Cinema of Poetry, argued that proper cinematic objectivity cannot be accomplished by means of the long take or the long shot, separate from the point of view of any character, because this long take or idealized perspective would simply be the point of view of a flesh and blood cameraman instructed to stand there by the director. Free indirect discourse, however, is far from an interior monologue. Instead, it is accomplished by the use of the character's language and perspective. But it is not purely a subjective shot, which fulfills the same role, or in other words, a point of view shot, which fulfills the same role in cinema as direct dialogue or quotation fulfills in literature. Instead, free and indirect discourse arises somewhere between these two different shots. In contrast to André Bazin, Pasolini argued that cinematic objectivity is a function of montage. In other words, it is accomplished by the multiplication of perspectives, by a series of point of view shots which overcomes the false and supposedly objective nature of the long take or sequence shot. For Pasolini, as for Deleuze, multiple focalization, or a series of overlapping points of view, both ideal and that of the characters, is the route to this kind of objective montage, one which detaches itself from what Deleuze described as the sensory motor niche situation at hand. So in his seminal essay, The Cinema of Poetry, and analyzing Michelangelo Antonioni's film Il Deserto Rosso, Red Desert, Pasolini expresses himself thus. I'm going to give a long quote. "The close-up of two viewpoints, scarcely different from each other upon the same object, that is, the succession of two shots which frame the same portion of reality, first from close in, then from a little further away, or else at first head-on, then a little obliquely, or else finally, quite simply, on the same alignment but with two different lenses. From this arises an insistence which becomes obsessive as myth of the pure and anguishing autonomous beauty of things. The technique, which consists in having characters enter and leave the frame so that the montage is a succession of a series of pictures, allows for the world to appear as ordered by the myth of a pure pictorial beauty, which the characters invade. And let me compare that to a quote from Deleuze's work, Cinema 2. The crystalline regime, he argues, quote, is completely different. The actual is cut off from its motor linkages, or the real from its legal connections, and the virtual, for its part, detaches itself from its actualizations, starts to be valid for itself. I know that time is short, but I'd like to show at least 1 or 2 minutes of a clip from Pasolini's film Il Vangelo secondo Matteo, the Gospel according to St. Matthew. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me see, let's hope this, here we are. And let's hope that this is where the Magi visit the infant Jesus and his parents. Okay, hold on 1 second. So hopefully you can all see that. I'm just going to play a minute or so of it.
E quando l'avrete trovato fatemelo sapere, perché
don't need to worry about the Italian.
rendergli omaggio. Okay, I wish I could show you more of that, but just for reasons of time. I think you saw in that clip, however, there is a multiplication of point of view shots between the parents of the Christ child, Mary and Joseph, and also the Magi, but also shots from an idealized perspective, stepping back, coming forward. There's a zoom and shots, establishing shots of various distances from the group. And all of this creates an unsettled feeling in the viewer's mind and make us ask ourselves from which perspective we are viewing the scene. In fact, really, we are not seeing it from any perspective. The rather jerky framing technique prevents us from being able to even identify a stable vantage point where an impersonal or anonymous narrator, cameraman might be situated. This allows, in my view, for the expression of free and direct discourse and for the emergence of the perspective of a third person, that perspective which reflects the cinema of poetry in the view of Pasolini and Deleuze. Just to conclude then, and maybe if that was a bit rapid, I might explain a bit more in the questions. Deleuze stressed anonymity and impersonality as a condition of the literary, cinematic or philosophical author, arguing at various moments in his collection of essays, Essays Critical and Clinical, that, quote, writing is a question of becoming, always incomplete, always in the midst of being formed, and goes beyond the matter of any livable or lived experience. And also, it is not the first two persons that function as a condition for literary enunciation. Literature begins only when a third person is born within us that strips us of the power to say I, end quote. In cinema and literature, therefore, the birth of the third person that arises between author and character allows the real cinema or literature of poetry to be born. Such a third person relies on a profound and central relationship between author and character, as profound as that between Flaubert and Madame Bovary. But that relationship must express a blurring, a distillation of the boundaries between these two, such that it becomes impossible to tell where one begins and the other ends. It is therefore my view that the concept of free indirect discourse from Pasolini, but reflected through Deleuze, is and must be central to our developing new understanding and explanation of the Deleuzian author. Miraba. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate Niall for your time usage, and this is very, very sophisticated presentation. So we all appreciate with your effort. I am very sorry not to get the questions, but I'm sure that we came together to make life better with cinema, with philosophy. There are a lot of big effort here. So I would like to thank the speakers, the audience, and the organization team. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything.